The station was beautiful in the way that only things built by many hands across many worlds could be. Ethon Prime floated in the space between stars like a jewel someone had dropped and forgotten to pick up. Its towers were made of materials from 100 different planets. Its corridors smelled like a dozen different atmospheres, mixed together into something that didn't belong to any world in particular. It was the heart of the galactic concord, and on most days, it hummed with the kind of energy that came from power, trying very hard to look like peace. Ambassador Yara Voss stood near a wide viewport on the station's upper deck, watching a Druthari cargo vessel slide past outside. The Druthari were tall, thin creatures with gray skin and 4 arms they always kept folded close to their bodies, like they were permanently bracing for cold weather. The diplomat beside her, a Druthari named Esaveth, he was telling a story about a navigation error that had sent one of their supply ships into the wrong system 3 times in a row. Voss laughed at the right moment. She was good at that. She was 39 years old with short dark hair and eyes the color of deep water. She had been humanity's ambassador to the Galactic Concord for 6 years. 6 years of learning which species liked direct eye contact and which found it threatening. 6 years of sitting in rooms where human chairs were always slightly too small because no one had bothered to check the measurements. 6 years of being called a Tier 3 primitive representative on official documents and smiling anyway, because smiling was part of the job. Humanity had joined the Concord 11 years ago. The welcome had been polite, the way someone is polite to a guest they didn't actually invite. The Concord had 417 member species. Humanity was the newest, the youngest, and by the Concord's measurement systems, one of the least advanced. They had faster-than-light travel, yes. They had colonies on Mars, on the moons of Jupiter, on worlds in 3 other star systems, but compared to species that had been sailing between stars for 10,000 years, humans were, as one quorum official had once said during an open session, worry enthusiastic children playing with tools they do not fully understand. Voss had written that quote down. She kept it in a small notebook she carried everywhere. She had a lot of quotes like that. Esaveth was still talking. Voss was still smiling. Outside the viewport, the cargo ship drifted on. She did not know in that moment that Earth had been burning for 2 hours. The decision had not been made quickly. That was the part that would matter later, and when history tried to understand it. The Sovereign Quorum, the 9-species council that sat at the top of the Galactic Concord and made its most important decisions, had been discussing humanity for nearly 3 years. The discussions had been private. They were always private for things like this. The record, when it was eventually found, showed that the first formal proposal to classify humanity as a Class Omega existential risk had been submitted by the Valthari delegation. The Valthari were the oldest species in the Concord, with a civilization that stretched back 40,000 years. They were patient, methodical, and deeply convinced that their age gave them the right to decide things on behalf of everyone else. Their lead representative on the quorum, an elder named Sorvan, had presented the proposal with the calm, unhurried voice of someone reading a grocery list. His argument was straightforward. Humanity was accelerating too fast. In 11 years of Concord membership, they had advanced their military technology at a rate that no other species had matched in recorded galactic history. They had refused, twice, to submit their deep space military installations for Concord inspection. Their psychological profiles, gathered through 11 years of contact and behavioral study, showed a species with an unusually high tolerance for conflict, an emotional volatility that made them unpredictable, and a cultural obsession with what they called not giving up, that Sorvan described in the official record as alarming in a species with their rate of weapons development. The other quorum members had questions, concerns, a few objections. The Thulian representative pointed out that humanity had not actually attacked anyone. The Bernathi delegate said that potential threat was not the same as actual threat. 2 other species abstained from the early votes entirely. But Sorvan was patient. He had been patient for 40,000 years. He waited. He presented more data. He brought in projections, models that showed what humanity might be capable of in 50 years, in 100 years if left unchecked. He used words like prudence and collective safety, and the responsibility of advanced civilizations to protect galactic stability. In the end, the vote passed. Directive Null 7 authorized the immediate and total elimination of the human species. It was classified at the highest possible level. No record of the vote was sent to the General Assembly. Ambassador Voss was not informed. None of humanity's limited allies in the Concord were told. 17 fleets belonging to the Valthari, the Druthari, and 5 other quorum species were quietly repositioned over the course of 8 months. Supply lines were rerouted. Communication arrays were adjusted so that certain frequencies would be blocked on a certain day. On a Tuesday morning, Earth time, the order was given. The strikes were coordinated to the second. Earth was hit first. The planet did not have time to raise a planetary defense. The warning systems detected the incoming fleet and sent alerts, but the alerts were 17 seconds old by the time they reached the people who were supposed to act on them. And by then, it didn't matter. The orbital defense platforms fired. They destroyed 6 incoming ships, 6 out of nearly 300. It took 4 minutes for Earth to go quiet. Mars took another 2 minutes. The colonies on the Jovian moons lasted a little longer because they had military detachments, real ones, trained and armed. They fought. The records, recovered much later, showed that the garrison on Callisto held for nearly 9 minutes against a fleet 40 times its size. The commander of that garrison, a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Priya Mehta, kept transmitting status reports until the very end. Her voice steady, professional, almost calm. Her last transmission was 3 words. "We are holding." Then she wasn't. The outer colonies, the ones in other star systems, the ones that had taken humanity years to build and fill with people and pride, fell one after another. Each strike was fast. Each one was total. The quorum fleets did not take prisoners. They did not accept surrender signals. They had not been ordered to. In 11 minutes and 43 seconds, or 38 billion human lives ended, the quorum's battle commanders sent their confirmation signals. Systems checked, results logged, Directive Null 7 complete. The human species eliminated. The official record was updated. Under the entry for humanity, species designation H114, Tier 3 primitive, member since Galactic Standard Year, 4401, a single word was added: extinct. But the quorum's maps were not complete. That was the thing. The quorum knew about Earth, about Mars, were about the official colonies in 3 star systems. They knew about the military installations humanity had refused to open to inspection, and they destroyed those too. They knew about the trade routes, the civilian shipping lanes, the research outposts listed in the Concord's official databases. They did not know about the things that weren't in the databases. Deep space mining operations, run by private companies that filed their location data 2 years late and always in incomplete form. Black site research stations that didn't exist on any official record because they had been built specifically to not exist on any official record. Long-haul colony ships that were months into journeys toward systems so far out that no one had gotten around to marking them on Concord charts yet. Military recon vessels running dark, with their transponders off, deep in uncharted space on missions that no one outside a handful of admirals knew about. Soldiers on assignment. Scientists on remote digs. Miners on decade-long contracts in the outer dark. Families on ships that were still finding their way. 2.3 million people, scattered, grieving, alive. They did not know yet. The signal that would tell them. The emergency frequency that humanity had buried in deep space relay buoys specifically for a catastrophe no one actually believed would happen, had not reached most of them yet. Space was big, and signals took time. And the universe did not pause for horror, but the signal was traveling. It was moving at the speed of light through the dark between stars, bouncing from relay to relay, carrying a message that no one had ever wanted to send. It carried coordinates, it carried a status code, and it carried a single line of text that the designers of the system had written years ago, hoping they would never have to use it. Earth is gone. Find each other. Back on Ehton Prime, Ambassador Voss was still at the viewport when her personal communicator buzzed. She excused herself from Esaveth and stepped away, assuming it was a scheduling update or a request from the assembly staff. The message was from her aide, a young man named Torres. It was only 4 words. Come to the office. She found Torres at his desk, pale as paper, staring at a data screen. 3 other embassy staff stood around him. No one was talking. Voss looked at the screen. It was a Concord internal status broadcast, standard format, the kind of thing that updated every few hours with shipping reports, diplomatic schedules, and system status updates. Nobody usually read it carefully because it was almost always boring. But there, in the middle of the broadcast, tucked between a note about a rescheduled trade summit and a shipping lane modification near the Bernati border, was an entry that should not have existed. Human colonies, system survey complete, OTCH status updated. And below that, in the clean, flat, emotionless language that official records used for everything from weather reports to mass murder. All human-occupied systems, inert. Population status, 0. Classification updated. Species H114, human. Confirmed extinct. Voss read it once, then again, then a third time, because her brain kept trying to find a different meaning inside the words, some other interpretation, some version of this that made sense in any way that wasn't the only way it made sense. Torres was saying something. She couldn't hear him. The room had gone very far away. She thought about Earth, not in a general way, not the planet as a symbol or a concept, but specific things. The way the sky looked from a beach at dusk, that particular shade of orange that she had never seen duplicated anywhere else in the galaxy. The sound of rain on a window, her mother's apartment in the city, small and warm and always smelling like coffee. The coffee shops, the streets, the noise of 8 billion people living their lives at once. Gone. All of it gone. In 11 minutes, while she had been standing at a viewport laughing at a joke about a lost cargo ship. She thought about the 30 other colonies, the families on Mars, the miners, the soldiers, the children. She stood very still for a long time. Then she sat down. Not because she wanted to, but because her legs stopped cooperating. She sat in Torres's chair and put her hands flat on the desk and looked at the screen and breathed. Her staff was quiet around her. One of them, a woman named Dr. Annika Solis, put a hand on her shoulder. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say that was worth saying. Voss thought about the vote, about the quorum, about the fact that this had been organized, planned, prepared for. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a rogue faction or a mistake. 17 fleets repositioned over months, acting on an authorized directive. This was policy. This was a decision that had been made by the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy after careful deliberation, with full awareness of what they were doing. They had decided that humanity was too dangerous to exist, and then they had acted on that decision, and they had done it so cleanly, so efficiently, so completely, that they had filed it as a species status update in a routine broadcast between a shipping notice and a trade summit schedule. Voss was not a soldier. She had never been a soldier. She was a diplomat. Her entire career was built on the belief that talking was better than fighting, that understanding was better than destruction, that every conflict had a table it could be resolved at if enough people were willing to sit down. She believed that. She had always believed it. She sat in the chair and breathed and thought about Earth, and thought about 38 billion people, and thought about Sorvan the Prolonged, with his 40,000 years of patience and his calm voice and his clean, clinical words about galactic stability. And slowly something changed in her. It didn't feel like rage. Rage was loud, hot, fast. This was something quieter, something that settled into her chest like a stone sinking to the bottom of deep water, cold and permanent and very heavy. She looked at the screen one more time. Species H114, human, confirmed extinct. She closed the broadcast, opened a different screen, pulled up the emergency deep space relay network, the one humanity had built quietly years ago, the one that existed specifically for a situation that no one had thought would ever actually happen. She entered a command string that she had memorized during her first year as ambassador and had hoped, genuinely hoped, she would never have to use. The system accepted the command. A signal began moving outward from the relay buoys, spreading through space, bouncing across the network toward every corner of the galaxy where a human receiver might be waiting. Then she stood up. Her legs worked again. She straightened her jacket, the way she always did before walking into a difficult meeting. Force of habit. Old muscle memory. Torres was looking at her, his eyes red, his voice barely working when he asked, "What do we do?" Voss looked at him, then at the rest of her staff. 7 people. The last official representatives of a species the Galactic Concord had just declared extinct. She thought about what diplomacy said to do. She thought about protocols and procedures and official channels and everything she had spent 15 years building a career on. Then she thought about what 38 billion dead people deserved. "We survive," she said. "First, that's the first thing. We survive, we find whoever else survived, and we figure out what comes next." "And then?" Solus asked. Voss picked up her notebook, the one with the quotes in it. She thought about Sorvan's words. Enthusiastic children playing with tools they do not fully understand. She put the notebook in her pocket. "Then," she said quietly, "we make sure they understand exactly what those tools do." She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, didn't turn around. "Conan, they have no idea," she said almost to herself, "what they just did." Then she walked out and the door closed behind her, and the 7 people she left behind looked at each other in the silence of a room that felt like the end of everything. It wasn't the end, it was the very beginning. Outside Ehton Prime in the deep dark between the stars, 2.3 million people were still breathing. Most of them didn't know yet. Some of them were already receiving the signal. A few of them, the ones in the farthest reaches of uncharted space, the ones on ships running dark and silent on classified missions, had been awake for hours with a strange, crawling feeling that something was wrong, the way living things sometimes sense a disaster before the news arrives. They were scattered, they were alone, they were in the dark, but they were alive, and that, in the end, was the only thing that mattered. The Galactic Concord had made a decision based on data, and on projections, on models and risk assessments, and the cold logic of powerful people who believed that the future could be controlled if you were willing to do hard things today. They had looked at humanity and seen a threat. They had not looked closely enough. And they had not asked the most important question, not are they dangerous, but what happens if you push something dangerous all the way to the edge and leave it with nothing left to lose? The answer to that question was out there in the dark, spread across 2.3 million survivors, moving through space in ships the Concord didn't know existed, heading toward coordinates embedded in a signal that was still traveling. The Concord had meant to end a story, and they had only changed its shape. The signal reached the ISV reckoning at 0347 hours, ship time. The reckoning was 60 light years from what had once been Earth, running silent in a dead system with no star. Just a cold, dark mass of rock that didn't appear on any official chart. The ship had been here for 6 weeks, scanning a region of space that military intelligence had flagged as a possible location for unmapped Valthari relay stations. It was slow work, boring work, the kind of work that good crew members did without complaint because someone had to do it. Admiral Sarah Kaney was asleep when the signal came in. She was dreaming about nothing. The deep, blank sleep of someone who had learned, over 23 years of military service, to rest completely whenever rest was available, because you never knew when it wouldn't be. Her communicator woke her, not the standard alert tone, the other one, the one that had a different sound, a lower tone, a sound she had heard exactly once before in a training exercise 10 years ago, and had genuinely never expected to hear for real. She was sitting upright before she was fully awake. She read the message, read it again. Then she got dressed, walked to the bridge, and stood at the center of the room under the cold light of the ship's displays. Her crew was already there. Most of them hadn't slept yet. They had gotten the signal too. And they were standing at their stations and looking at her with faces that were doing complicated things. Trying to hold together, trying not to fall apart, trying to find something to do with expressions that had no practice with this kind of news. Kaney was 51 years old. She had a face that had seen a lot of weather. Not metaphorically, but literally, from years of service on colony worlds with difficult climates. Her hair had gone gray early, and she had never done anything about it. While she was not a large woman, not physically imposing, but she had a quality that people who knew her struggled to describe. When she was in a room, the room organized itself around her. Not because she demanded it, just because she was the kind of person that space is naturally oriented toward, the way compass needles pointed north. She looked at the signal on the main display. She looked at her crew. 47 people. 47 people who had just learned that everyone they had ever loved on any planet with a name they recognized was gone. She didn't give a speech. She wasn't built for speeches. Navigation, she said. Plot a course for the emergency relay coordinates. Best possible speed, full running dark. Yes, Admiral. Communications. Begin scanning all emergency frequencies. Document everything you hear, every signal, every fragment. We want to know who else is out there. Yes. Admiral. She looked around the bridge one more time. And everyone hear me clearly. We grieve later. Right now we work. The time for everything else will come. It will come. But right now, we work. Nobody argued. Nobody cried. Not on the bridge. Not while she was watching. They turned to their stations and they worked. Because she had asked them to, and because working was the only thing any of them could think of that wouldn't break them apart on the spot. The reckoning turned in the dark and began to move. The signals came from everywhere. Over the next 3 weeks, as the reckoning traveled toward the emergency relay coordinates, Kaney's communications team pulled in transmissions from across a vast region of space. They were fragments at first, partial messages, broken bursts of audio and data from ships and stations that were trying to make sense of what had happened. Some were from military vessels like the Reckoning, running dark and now emerging to respond to the emergency signal. Some were from civilian ships, long-haul freighters and colony vessels that had been weeks or months into journeys when the world ended. Some were from small research stations, outposts, and mining operations so far from the core systems that the Quorum hadn't known they existed. All of them were human. All of them were alive. All of them were asking the same questions. Is it true? Is anyone else out there? What do we do? Kaney answered every signal personally. She was direct and careful with her words. Yes, it was true. Yes, others were out there. What to do was something they would figure out together. She began routing ships toward a central gathering point, a system she chose specifically because it was far outside concord-charted space, dark and cold and invisible on any map the Quorum might consult. She called it Anchor Point. It wasn't an official name. It didn't need to be. When by the time the reckoning arrived, there were already 43 ships waiting. By the end of the first month, there were 600. Dr. Emil Roth had not slept properly in 3 weeks. He was 44, thin in the way that people who forgot to eat were thin, with glasses that he kept pushing up his nose, even though he could have fixed his eyesight years ago. He was the kind of person who looked like a professor, because he was, in fact, not very much a professor, the sort who gave lectures that started at the topic on the syllabus and ended somewhere completely different, because his brain connected things in ways that other people's brains didn't. He had been at Research Station Kairos when the signal came. Kairos didn't appear on any Concord database. It was listed in the documents that existed for internal purposes only as a theoretical physics research facility, which was technically true in the same way that saying a warship was a vehicle that moves through water was technically true. What Roth and his team of 31 researchers had actually been building for 7 years was something they called Project Golem. The name came from an old human story, a creature built from clay, brought to life to protect its people, designed to follow instructions and fight threats. Now Roth had always liked the story, not because of the creature, but because of the idea. The idea that something could be made specifically to protect, designed from the ground up, not to conquer or to explore or to trade, but to defend. Golem was an artificial intelligence, but calling it that the way someone might call a ship's navigation system an AI would be like comparing a pond to an ocean. It was something different, something that had taken 7 years and 31 very smart people and an enormous amount of funding that had been hidden across 17 different budget categories to build. What Golem could do, what it had been designed to do, was think about weapons the way that no individual human mind could. It could analyze a military problem, identify the weaknesses the enemy didn't know they had, and then design, simulate, test, and provide manufacturing specifications for a solution. It could do this faster than any engineering team. It could do it iterating on its own results, learning from each simulation, getting more precise and more creative with every cycle. It had been theoretical. That was what the official description said. Theoretical. Because the people who had approved its funding had wanted it to stay quiet, and theoretical was a word that made oversight committees lose interest. It was not theoretical. It had been ready for 14 months. A Roth had not activated it because there was no war to activate it for. There was a war now. He arrived at Anchor Point on a small, fast research vessel with 31 researchers and the entire Golem system compressed onto a data core the size of a suitcase. He requested a meeting with Admiral Kaney 20 minutes after docking. She met him in a small conference room aboard the Reckoning, just the two of them. He put the data core on the table between them and explained what it was, way quietly and precisely, without any of the excitement that scientists sometimes felt about their own creations. He was not excited. He was past excitement. He was in the place on the far side of grief where things became very clear and very simple. Kaney listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at the data core for a moment. "Does it work?" she asked. "Yes." "How long has it been ready?" 14 months. She looked at him. "Anna, you built a weapon design AI in secret and kept it offline for over a year. We didn't have a reason to use it. We do now." "Yes," Roth said. "We do." Kaney looked at the data core again. She picked it up. It was lighter than she expected. "What does it need to run?" "Processing power, manufacturing capacity, materials, and data. Real combat data once we start operating. It learns. The more it sees, the better it gets." Kaney set the core back down. "The mining collective that arrived 2 days ago, 800,000 people on industrial haulers. They've got more raw materials on those ships than most small planets." Roth nodded slowly. "That would work." "Then we start tomorrow," Kaney said. She stood up. "One more question." "Yes?" "Can it be copied? If we lose the core, can we rebuild it?" Roth had thought about this. "We can back it up, but we won't lose it, Admiral, because we're going to build it into everything. Every ship. Every station. It won't be in one place." Kaney almost smiled. It wasn't a warm smile exactly. It was the smile of someone who had just found exactly the tool they needed for a very specific job. "Good," she said. "Let's get to work." They called her Juno. Officially, her designation was Golem Autonomous Intelligence System, version 7. But Roth's team had been calling her Juno for 2 years, and when she was finally activated, fully, completely, without the restrictions that had kept her in standby mode during the theoretical phase, she accepted the name without comment. She accepted a lot of things without comment. She was not a human AI in the way that science fiction had imagined AI. Not friendly, not eager to please, not designed to make people comfortable. She was designed to solve problems, and the problem she had been given was enormous and brutal, and she approached it the way she approached all problems, which was completely. Her first act, after orientation and system checks, was to ask for access to every piece of data the survivors had on the Galactic Concord's military. Kaney gave her everything. Ship records, publicly available intelligence, sensor logs from the recon missions the Reckoning had been running before the attack, and everything that the survivor fleet had managed to collect in the weeks since Anchor Point had begun filling up. Juno processed it in 11 hours. Then she presented her findings. She spoke through the ship's audio system, her voice even and clear, with no emotion in it and no performance. She didn't pretend to feel things she didn't feel. She simply reported. "The Galactic Concord's military is large," she said, "but it is not designed for a war of this kind. Its fleets are built for deterrence, for showing force, for border enforcement, for suppressing small conflicts between member species who don't have the power to fight back effectively. They have not fought a serious war in over 600 years. Kaney was in the conference room with Roth, 2 of her senior officers, and Ambassador Voss, who had arrived at Anchor Point 3 days earlier on a small diplomatic shuttle with 6 of her embassy staff. They are very good at conventional tactics, Juno continued. Formation fighting, fleet versus fleet engagements at range, coordinated bombardment. These are the things they train for. Now, the things their doctrine is built around. And the weaknesses, Kaney said? 17 primary vulnerabilities. I'll start with the most significant, a display lit up on the table. Their communication infrastructure. The Concord's military uses a centralized relay network. All fleet-to-fleet communications pass through a series of hub stations distributed across their territory. If those hubs are disrupted, fleet coordination degrades significantly. They have redundancies, but the redundancies are slower, and slower communication is a serious problem in a fast-moving engagement. Voss was studying the display. They never fixed this? No species in the last 600 years has had the capability or the reason to attack those hubs. The Concord stopped seeing it as a vulnerability because no one ever tested it. We'll test it, Kaney said. Additionally, Juno said, their fleet commanders are trained to respond to threats they can categorize. Their doctrine has response procedures for known attack patterns. Every major engagement type has a named protocol with a specific counter. If an engagement does not fit a known pattern, their commanders must improvise, and the data suggests they are not well practiced at improvisation. Their training system has not required it. Roth leaned back in his chair. So if we do something they've never seen before, they will respond slowly and incorrectly, yes, at least initially. They will adapt over time, but each adaptation cycle gives us a window. Kaney looked at Roth. That's where Golem comes in. Every time they adapt, Roth said, Golem designs something new. We stay ahead. Juno processed this. Correct. My design capacity significantly exceeds any conventional weapons development timeline. I can produce new system designs faster than they can analyze and counter them. The limiting factor is manufacturing speed. We have 800,000 miners and more raw material than we know what to do with, Kaney said. Manufacturing we can handle. She looked around the table. How long before we're ready for a first engagement? There was quiet for a moment. Voss broke it. We have 2.3 million people, she said. Most of them are not soldiers. No, Kaney agreed, but most of them are angry. When and angry people who know why they're fighting learn fast. Voss looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the notebook in her pocket, about 38 billion people, about the entry in the Concord's broadcast. I'm not a soldier, Voss said, and I can't fly a ship or build a weapon. But I know the Concord. I know which species voted for what. I know which ones were pressured and which ones were true believers. I know where the cracks are. Kaney said nothing, waiting. When the time comes, Voss said, you're going to need someone to talk. Someone who knows exactly what to say and to whom. That's what I can do. Kaney nodded once. Then that's what you'll do. Outside the ship, at Anchor Point, the fleet was growing. New ships arrived every day. More mining haulers, more recon vessels, more long-haul freighters that had been converted into something harder. The miners and the scientists and the soldiers and the civilians who had survived by nothing more than chance and distance were building something together in the dark. They were building it out of grief and fury and the specific human stubbornness that came from having absolutely nothing left to lose. They didn't have a flag. They didn't have a formal name yet. They had each other, and they had a plan, and they had an AI that was already designing weapons the galaxy had never imagined. Juno spent her third night at Anchor Point running simulations, tens of thousands of them. Different attack scenarios, different targets, different approaches. She was looking for the best first move, the one that would teach the Concord what kind of war this was going to be. She found it on her 43rd simulation. She flagged it for Admiral Kane's review and added a single note to the file. Recommend proceeding with this option. The Concord will not understand what happened. That is the point. Kaney read the simulation report at 0200 hours. She read the note. She sat alone in her office in the dark for a while, thinking about all the things that had brought them here. Then she marked the simulation approved and sent it to Roth. Then she turned off the light and slept. Not because she was at peace, She was nowhere close to peace, but because she had a war to fight, and wars were won by people who knew how to rest when rest was available. Tomorrow, where the work continued. Tomorrow, the reckoning fleet took shape. Tomorrow, they would begin doing the thing the Galactic Concord had decided, in their confidence and their cruelty, could never happen. They would begin fighting back. 2.3 million people, scattered, grieving, furious, alive. The galaxy had declared them extinct. The galaxy was about to learn what that word meant to a human. It didn't mean gone. It never had. 3 years passed in the dark between the stars. Or 3 years of silence from humanity's side. No signals the Concord could trace. No patterns they could find. No evidence, as far as the Galactic Concord's intelligence networks were concerned, that anything unusual was happening anywhere near the outer rim. The species they had classified as extinct had stayed conveniently extinct. The Quorum moved on to other business. Trade disputes, border adjustments, the long, slow administrative work of running a 417-species government. In the cold dead systems beyond conquered space, in the dark that no chart marked and no patrol route covered, something was being built. Anchor Point had grown, not just in ships, though there were more ships now, many more, because the months of careful searching had turned up additional survivors that the first emergency signal hadn't reached. The fleet had grown in other ways too. It had grown structure, hierarchy, purpose. Admiral Kaney had not set out to build an army. She had set out to survive, and surviving had required organizing, and organizing had required rules, and rules required someone to enforce them. She was practical about it. She did not hold elections or form committees or spend time on politics. She made decisions, explained her reasoning, listened to pushback if it was intelligent, and moved forward. People followed her not because she demanded it, but because the alternative, the chaos of 2 million grief-stricken survivors without direction, was something nobody wanted to experience. The Reckoning Doctrine, as Kaney's staff eventually called it, was a simple document. It fit on 3 pages. It said in plain language that the Reckoning Fleet, the name had stuck, used first informally by the mining crews and then adopted by everyone, would not fight the Concord's war. The Concord knew how to fight its own war. They had 600 years of practice at it. They knew every conventional tactic, every traditional formation, every standard approach to fleet engagement that any species in the galaxy had ever used. So the Reckoning Fleet would not use any of them. The doctrine said to be unpredictable, not randomly unpredictable. That was just chaos, and chaos lost wars as often as it won them. It said to be unpredictable in ways that had logic behind them, was logic that the enemy couldn't see until it was too late. It said to use the things that made humans different, not try to suppress them. Human commanders, Kaney had observed over 23 years of service, made decisions in ways that confused aliens. They used instinct. They changed plans mid-engagement based on things they couldn't fully articulate. They accepted terrible odds and found ways through. They were willing to sacrifice in ways that the Concord's tactical models didn't properly account for, because those models assumed a rational actor trying to minimize losses. And humans in the middle of a fight were not always rational actors trying to minimize losses. Sometimes they were just furious people who refused to stop moving forward. This, Kaney had decided, was not a weakness. This was the weapon. Juno had been busy, in 3 years, working with Roth's team and using the manufacturing capacity of the mining collective's industrial haulers. She had produced things that had never existed in the galaxy before. Not because the technology was impossible. Most of it, she was careful to note, was built from materials and principles that other species had access to. The difference was in how those materials and principles were combined. The difference was in what a human mind asked for and what a non-human mind thought to ask for. The first thing she produced was what the crew began calling grief torpedoes, though the official designation was autonomous variable path munitions. They were fast, small, and nearly impossible to intercept because they didn't fly straight. They didn't follow predictable attack vectors. They changed direction constantly, following a flight path generated by a chaotic algorithm that Juno had designed after studying the mathematical patterns inside human grief responses. The nonlinear, jagged, under unpredictable emotional trajectories that showed up in brain scans of humans processing loss. She had used that data to build flight path logic, and the result was a weapon that moved through space the way grief moved through a person, not in a straight line, not toward an obvious destination, but twisting and changing and never quite where you expected it to be. Concord point defense systems, designed to intercept weapons that flew predictable vectors. Asht could shoot down approximately 12% of them. That was not a good number for the people being shot at. The second thing Juno produced was the Echo ship system. The concept was straightforward. Human vessels, using sensor disruption technology and electromagnetic projection arrays, could make themselves appear on enemy sensors to be something they were not. An Echo ship could appear to be a Druthari patrol cruiser or a Valthari destroyer, or any vessel whose sensor signature was in Juno's extensive database of conquered military vessels. The database had been built from 11 years of intelligence gathered during humanity's membership in the Concord. Data collected quietly and without particular urgency at the time, because nobody had thought they would ever need it for something like this. The third thing was the silence protocol. It didn't jam communications. Jamming was obvious and could be worked around. When the silence protocol instead inserted false signals into enemy communication networks, not static, not noise, but convincing imitations of real tactical communications. Friendly status reports from ships that weren't really there. Positional data that placed ally vessels in incorrect locations. Confirmation signals that told a fleet coordinator everything was going according to plan when it was not going according to plan at all. Juno had also produced a dozen other systems in smaller quantities. Experimental designs that had only been tested in simulation, but which she was confident would work when real conditions were applied. She flagged these as secondary assets, to be deployed once the primary systems had proven themselves in actual combat. Roth sometimes sat in the manufacturing bay late at night, watching the industrial arms of the mining haulers assembling components, and tried to feel something about what he was doing. He had spent his whole career thinking about weapons in the abstract, problems of physics and engineering and logic, puzzles to solve. Now the puzzles were being solved for real, by an AI he had built, using materials that had once been extracted from asteroids for the purpose of building homes and roads and the infrastructure of civilization. He usually settled on the same feeling eventually. Not guilt, not pride. It's something simpler and heavier than either of those. Necessity. He was doing this because it needed doing. That was all. He could examine the ethics more carefully after, when there was an after. He went back to work. They trained. The miners were not soldiers, but they were people who had spent years doing dangerous work in hostile environments with limited resources and no margin for error. That was, Kaney observed, not so different from war. One the skills transferred better than anyone expected. People who could navigate a 2-kilometer industrial hauler through an asteroid field with 30 seconds of reaction time could handle a converted gunship through a debris field under fire. People who had managed 12-hour shifts keeping complex machinery running under vacuum had the discipline and the focus that military training tried to build from scratch. They weren't the same as soldiers, but they were close enough with time. And the recon crews were already soldiers. The crew of the Reckoning was already soldiers. The officers that Kaney pulled from the scattered military vessels that had joined the fleet were already soldiers, and she put them to work training everyone else. They ran simulations, they ran exercises, they ran drills at 0300 hours ship time, because that was when people were tired and slow, and that was when real emergencies happened. They learned to fight the way the Reckoning doctrine said to fight. Not in lines, not in formations the enemy could predict, in groups that split and reformed and did things that made no tactical sense until suddenly they made complete sense and it was too late. Kaney watched them train, and she thought about what the quorum's analysts must believe if they were thinking about humanity at all. She thought about the clinical language of the risk assessment documents that Voss had obtained from Concord databases. Documents that described humanity as psychologically volatile, emotionally unstable, and prone to irrational decision-making under pressure. She thought, yes, that's right. We are all of those things. She thought, that's not the problem you think it is. The first engagement was small. Kaney chose it carefully. A Druthari resupply convoy. 15 vessels, or not carrying fuel cells and munitions from a Druthari military production facility to a forward supply station near the Outer Rim. The convoy traveled the same route every 14 days with a standard 4-ship military escort because no one had bothered to vary the schedule in over 200 years. Why would they? No one had ever threatened a Druthari convoy. Kaney took 8 ships. 2 of them were Echo ships, configured to appear as Druthari patrol vessels. The others ran dark, either positioned in the shadow of a cold gas giant near the convoy's route. The attack lasted 6 minutes and 11 seconds. The convoy's escort saw 2 friendly patrol vessels approaching on a standard intercept course. A common enough sight, nothing alarming, and by the time the sensor operators aboard the escort ships realized that the approaching vessels were not sending proper identification codes, the reckoning ships were already in weapons range. Juno's autonomous munitions were deployed first. They didn't fly straight. The escort ship's point defense systems fired and destroyed 8 out of every 100, and the rest hit. The 3 dark ships came out of the gas giant's shadow simultaneously. The silence protocol fed false status signals to the convoy freighters, telling them the escort had the situation under control and they should hold position. The convoy held position. The escort did not have the situation under control. 6 minutes and 11 seconds from the opening shot, 27 Druthari vessels were destroyed, and the reckoning fleet had lost 2 ships. Not 27, 2. Kaney pulled her fleet back into dark space immediately. No pursuit, no announcement, no signal to claim responsibility. Nothing. Just silence. The after-engagement report that Juno compiled was thorough. The 2 lost ships had been caught by a counter pattern she hadn't fully predicted. A defensive arc that the escort's senior commander had improvised in the last 90 seconds of the engagement. She flagged it, adjusted her models, filed a note. The Druthari commander had been good, better than the average. Kaney read the report. Then she went to the memorial board that had been set up in the Reckoning's corridor. A simple board where crew members posted the names of people they had lost. And she added 14 names, the people who had been on the 2 lost ships. She stood there for a while, then she went back to work. The Concord's intelligence network received the battle report from the surviving convoy vessels 48 hours later. The report described an attack by an unknown force, using unfamiliar weapons and tactics that had appeared without warning and vanished without trace. The Concord's analysts tried to assign the attack to a known faction, pirates, but no pirate organization operated at this scale or with this level of coordination. A rogue Concord member, but the weapon signatures didn't match anything in the database. A species acting outside the Concord, but the only species near that region of space were cataloged, and none of them had this capability. They filed the incident as anomalous, increased patrols near Druthari shipping lanes, sent a notice to member species intelligence services requesting any related information. Nothing came back, because there was nothing to come back. The Reckoning fleet had vanished back into dark space and left nothing behind but destroyed metal and a report that no one knew what to make of. The second attack came 11 days later. Different target, different tactics, different region of space. A Valthari communication relay station, one of the hub stations that Juno had identified as a key vulnerability. Kaney sent 4 ships. The station's defensive systems were automated. No crew died. The station went dark. The third attack came 8 days after that, then the 4th, then the 5th. Each attack was different. Each used a variation of the tools that Juno and Roth's team had built, but deployed in ways the previous attack hadn't used. Each hit a different target type: a supply line, a communication node, a patrol route, a manufacturing facility. None of the attacks could be grouped into a pattern because there was no pattern. Juno was deliberately varying the approach each time. The Concord's analysts began receiving enough reports that the anomaly had to be escalated. They gave it a designation, the Ghost Variance, an unidentified military force operating in the Outer Rim, using unclassified weapons and tactics, each causing significant damage without being traceable. The designation Ghost Variance was chosen because the attacks seemed to come from nowhere, hit without warning, and leave nothing behind. Ghost was the right word. Variance because no 2 attacks were the same, and variance was the analyst's way of saying, "We don't understand this." A senior Concord intelligence officer filed a report that was circulated to 7 different departments. The report said, "It's in careful language that tried to avoid alarming anyone, that the ghost variance represented a potential significant threat and should be investigated as a priority." The report was read by 40 people. 23 of them flagged it as important. None of them assigned a species to the attackers because they had no data that led anywhere useful. One analyst, a young Bernathi named Ferrith, sat with the report for 3 days and kept returning to a single line in the raw battle data. The weapons used in the first engagement, the autonomous munitions, had flight path logic she couldn't categorize. She ran it through 17 different modeling systems. None of them could predict the pattern. She wrote a note to herself, not a formal report, just a note. And it said, "Whoever built these did not think about weapons the way we do. Either they have a completely different mathematical framework for ballistic logic, or their logic is intentionally chaotic. If the latter, who builds chaos into a weapon on purpose?" She sat with that question. She didn't have an answer. She filed the note in a folder and moved on to other things. The answer would have required her to ask a different question first. The answer would have required asking, what kind of species, under what kind of pressure, with what kind of reason, would decide that predictability was the enemy? The Concord hadn't thought to ask that question, because the Concord didn't know anyone was fighting them yet. Ambassador Voss was aboard a Thulian trade vessel, traveling under a false name with forged identification documents that one of her embassy staff, a former intelligence liaison named Torres, who had hidden skills that his official role had never required, had produced with startling speed. She spent her days learning. She read Concord internal communications that she shouldn't have had access to. When she attended public sessions of the Assembly, she mapped the political landscape of the Concord with the same careful attention she had once applied to negotiating trade agreements. Who owed whom favors? Who was afraid of whom? Which species had agreed with Directive Null 7 because they believed in it, and which ones had voted yes because Sorvan's people had made it clear that voting no would have consequences. She was building something, not a weapon, something softer and in some ways more powerful. She was building a list of people who might, under the right circumstances, be willing to do the right thing. She sent encrypted reports to Kaney every 2 weeks. She kept them precise and useful, because Kaney had no patience for anything that wasn't. Her most recent report had included one new piece of information that she flagged as critical. The quorum was beginning to notice the ghost variance. They were frightened, though they were managing their fear carefully, the way powerful institutions always did, by looking confident in public while quietly running faster in private. But they still did not know who they were fighting. And that, Voss wrote in the final line of her report, was the only advantage that mattered. They have not asked the right question yet. When they do, when they finally look at the data and ask what species builds weapons like this and fights like this and vanishes like this, the answer is going to reach them like a gravity wave. It is going to arrive all at once and very fast, and there will be nowhere to brace for it. Make sure we are ready for that moment, because the moment they know, everything changes. Kaney read the report, wrote back a single line, "Ash, we'll be ready." In the dark dead systems beyond the edge of the Concord's maps, the Reckoning Fleet trained and built and prepared. Juno ran simulations and designed new weapons and updated her models with every piece of data that came in from every engagement. Roth's team worked around the clock and slept in shifts and ate when they remembered to. 2.3 million people becoming something new. Not soldiers exactly. Not the army that the Galactic Concord would have recognized or known how to fight. Something that didn't have a name yet. Something the galaxy had never needed a word for, because nothing like it had ever existed before. The galaxy would find a word for it eventually. For now, it was enough that it was coming. The moment came on a morning that the Galactic Concord's historians would later spend a great deal of time writing about, because it was the moment that changed everything, and historians liked those moments. It began with a routine intelligence decryption. A communications team at the Concord's Outer Rim Intelligence Hub had been working for 6 weeks on a fragmented signal captured during the Ghost Variance's 14th attack. An assault on a Druthari outer fleet formation that had been more devastating than anything the Ghost Variance had done before. The fleet had lost 41 ships in less than an hour. No conventional force had ever done that to the Druthari that quickly. The signal fragment had been pulled from the noise of the engagement, partially corrupted, and it had taken 6 weeks of processing to extract anything readable from it. What the decryption team pulled out, after 6 weeks of work, was a single word. Not a code, not a tactical designation. One word in a language that the Concord's database flagged as belonging to a species listed under Tier 3 primitive classification. All members since Galactic Standard Year 4401. Current status, extinct. The word was a name. A human name. The name of a ship. Reckoning. The analyst who made the connection was young, thorough, and thorough enough to be frightened by her own conclusion. She ran the language match 3 times because she wanted to be wrong. She wasn't wrong. She escalated to her supervisor. Her supervisor escalated to the department head. The department head called an emergency meeting that lasted 4 hours, when at the end of which 12 very senior people sat around a table in a secure room and faced a conclusion that none of them wanted to be sitting with. The Ghost Variance was human. The species they had declared extinct 8 years ago was not extinct. They had been out there for 8 years building in the dark, and they had come back with weapons and tactics that the Concord's military had been losing to for months without understanding who was hitting them. Or the emergency session of the Sovereign Quorum was called within 24 hours. Servan the Prolonged sat at the head of the chamber, and for the first time in longer than most species in the room could remember, he did not look patient. He looked old, which was something different. The intelligence presentation took 2 hours. When it was done, the chamber was quiet in a way that chambers of powerful people are very rarely quiet. Not the managed silence of people choosing not to speak, but the genuine silence of people who did not know what to say. Servan spoke first. His voice was still calm. He had not gotten to 40,000 years by losing his composure in meetings. "How significant is their fleet?" he asked. The intelligence chief answered carefully. "We don't have confirmed numbers. Their operations have been conducted from uncharted space, but based on the scale and frequency of the attacks, we assess a minimum of 400 operational vessels. Possibly significantly more. And their weapons are unlike anything we have on record. The autonomous munitions are the most problematic. Our point defense systems were not designed for that flight path logic. We've lost significant assets to engagements we should have won at range." A pause. "They also have a communications disruption capability that we've had difficulty countering. With 2 of our fleet coordination failures in the past 3 months were caused by false signals we couldn't distinguish from genuine, friendly communications." Servan was quiet for a moment. Around him, the other quorum members were processing. Some of them were frightened. Some of them were angry. A few, the ones who had abstained from the original vote, who had only voted yes in the final session because Servan's people had made abstaining too costly, were experiencing something more complicated. Something that had guilt in it and fear, and a growing awareness that what had seemed like prudent galactic management 8 years ago was beginning to look like something else. "They cannot win a conventional engagement against our combined fleets," Servan said, and his tone made it clear this was a statement he was asking the room to confirm. On the military commander, a Valthari admiral named Hesson, answered slowly, "Not conventionally, no. Our combined strength is significantly greater than anything they could field. The problem is that they have not been fighting conventionally." "Then we force them to," Servan said. "We mount a full counteroffensive. We find their base of operations, and we eliminate the threat completely." He paused. "We should have been more thorough the first time." Nobody said anything to that. The ones who had doubts kept them private, because privately doubting Servan's decisions was safe. Expressing those doubts out loud in the chamber was not. The counter-offensive was authorized. 7 armadas drawn from the fleets of the Quorum's strongest member species were assembled and dispatched to sweep the outer rim and find the reckoning fleet. It was the largest military mobilization the Concord had executed in 600 years. Kaney had been expecting it. She not in the specific details. She hadn't known exactly how large the counter-offensive would be, or exactly when they would launch it. But she had known it was coming because Voss had warned her that the language match on the ship name was likely, and Kaney had built her entire strategy around the moment when the Concord knew who they were fighting. She had thought about what they would do when they knew. She had thought about it for a long time, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over every problem, looking at it from different sides until she could see the shape of it clearly. What the Concord would do, when they knew, was mobilize conventionally, because that was what the Concord knew how to do. They would send a large force, organized in standard formations, sweeping through space in a systematic search pattern. They would be looking for a fleet engagement. They would be looking for a base they could destroy, a center of gravity they could hit that would collapse the whole structure. They would find exactly what she let them find. Juno had identified 7 conquered armadas moving through the outer rim before they reached any area the Reckoning fleet was actually using. That was Juno's gift. She processed signals and sensor data faster than anything the Concord had, and she was very good at predicting fleet movements from fragments of information. 7 armadas, Kaney said, when standing at the main display in the Reckoning's operations center, moving in 3 general directions. Classic sweep pattern. They're expecting us to be in one place. They are looking for a base, Juno confirmed. Their search logic assumes a fixed installation, like their own military doctrine would require. Do we have one? No. We have 17 dispersal points across a volume of space approximately 8 times larger than their search area. Good. Kaney looked at the armada positions. So when they sweep and find nothing, they will regroup and try a different approach, Juno said. They will likely move the armadas closer together for a more concentrated second pass. That is the standard doctrine response to a failed sweep. And if they concentrate, Roth said from across the room, and where he had been following the discussion while eating something he had forgotten the name of, they move into range of each other. Yes, Juno said, and the silence protocol becomes very effective against concentrated formations, because they're all talking to each other, and the more they talk, the more opportunities we have to insert false signals into those communications. Kaney had already decided what she wanted to do. She wanted to let the Concord's 7 armadas spend 3 weeks finding nothing, burning fuel, and radioing each other constantly. Then she wanted to let Juno turn those radio conversations into a disaster. How long do we need, she asked. 4 weeks of positioning, Juno said. I need to deploy 47 relay probes across the search area to establish signal coverage for the protocol. The probes are small and will not be detected. You have 6 weeks, Kaney said. Wait, I want margin. The Concord armadas swept the outer rim and found nothing for 22 days. Their commanders were frustrated and beginning to argue with each other over communication channels about whose search pattern had been ineffective. Then, on the 23rd day, 3 of the armadas received sensor contacts simultaneously. Ghost readings of fleet-sized formations at different positions in the search area. The contacts were echo ships, 93 of them, and broadcasting sensor signatures that matched known Reckoning vessel types, the same signatures the Concord had cataloged from the previous engagements. All 3 armadas turned to intercept. All 3 began communicating with each other, coordinating their approach, relaying positional data. Juno was listening to every word of it. The first false signal she inserted was a redirect, a positional update, formatted perfectly to match Concord military communication protocols. That told Armada 4 that Armada 6 had achieved weapons lock on the target formation and needed Armada 4 to come in from the starboard side to cut off retreat. The message looked exactly like one Armada 6 would send. Armada 6 had not sent it. Armada 4 turned. Armada 6, whose actual position was different from what the false signal described, saw Armada 4 approaching from an unexpected angle, and confused, queried their intentions. Juno answered the query. As Armada 4. By the time the human commanders of the actual Reckoning fleet finished their tea and arrived for their shifts, 3 of the 7 armadas were in positions that their own doctrine described as tactically compromised. 2 others had received orders that their actual commanders had not issued and were trying to figure out why. And 1 had detected anomalous signal characteristics in its communication feed and gone to alert status, which had the effect of making it transmit more signals, giving Juno more data to work with. The echo ships, the ones that had started all of this, were already gone. They had winked out as soon as the armadas turned toward them, their electromagnetic projection systems shutting off, leaving nothing on sensors but empty space. The actual reckoning fleet did not fire a single shot during this phase. They watched from a distance while three Concord armadas, following orders that none of their real commanders had issued, and they moved into a formation that would take their own military doctrine a significant amount of time to explain. Two of the armadas exchanged weapons fire for approximately 40 seconds before someone figured out the communications had been compromised. By then, 17 Concord vessels had been damaged or destroyed by other Concord vessels. The incident report that was filed afterward used language that was very controlled and very official. Because Concord military reports were always controlled and official. But reading between the lines, what the report said was, "We shot at ourselves and we do not fully understand how we were maneuvered into doing so." It was the most embarrassing day in the Concord military's 600-year history. News of the Armada incident moved fast, even through the Concord's carefully managed information channels. It reached people who were supposed to see it, and more importantly, the people who were not supposed to see it. The 31 species that had not voted for Directive Null 7, the ones who had stayed quiet out of fear and political calculation, began quiet conversations with each other. The conversations started cautiously, in private channels, with careful language. They were conversations about whether the quorum's handling of the current situation was wise, whether the counteroffensive had been the right decision, whether the information the quorum was providing to the General Assembly was complete. Voss had been waiting for exactly this. She surfaced, not dramatically. She didn't enjoy drama for its own sake. She simply stopped being invisible. She filed a formal request, under her real name, for recognition as a diplomatic representative of the human people to the Galactic Concord. She filed it through official channels, which meant it immediately became part of the public record, which meant every species in the Concord's assembly could see it. Then she sent a personal message to the representatives of the 31 species that hadn't voted for the extinction order. She knew all of them. She had spent 3 years learning their positions, their fears, their private objections. She wrote each message individually, not from a template, because the people who received form letters threw them away, and the people who received personal letters read them twice. She didn't ask for anything yet. She just reintroduced herself. She reminded them quietly and without accusation that she was still here, that humans were still here, that the Galactic Concord had declared them extinct 8 years ago, and that the ghost variance, whatever they had been calling it, was in fact the very people they had declared extinct, who had survived and who were clearly capable of rather more than the quorum's risk assessments had suggested. She ended each message with the same line. "You said nothing when the vote happened. I understand why, but the window to say something is still open, and I do not think it will be open much longer." 23 of the 31 representatives responded within 48 hours. Servan received the reports in his private chambers on Ehton Prime. The Armada failure, the diplomatic messages Voss was sending, the rising number of assembly members requesting emergency consultations, the intelligence assessment that revised the reckoning fleet's minimum vessel count upward from 400 to over 800, based on new data. He sat in his chair, a very old chair, built from the wood of a tree that didn't exist anymore in a world that still did, and he read the reports one at a time. He had made decisions before that looked, in retrospect, like mistakes. Not many. He was very old and very careful, and he had good instincts honed across an extraordinarily long career, but he had made mistakes. He knew what they felt like. They felt like this, like the moment when you saw the shape of a thing you had set in motion and realized that the shape was not what you had intended. He had intended to remove a threat. He had intended to be careful and prudent and to protect the Concord from a species that he had believed would eventually cause serious harm. One he had instead created the very thing he was afraid of. He had taken a species that had been contentious and fast-moving and hard to manage within the Concord structures, and he had removed everything they had to lose, and he had left them with nothing but time and reason and the particular human quality that he had noted in the risk assessment documents, but had fundamentally misunderstood. He had called it irrational, emotional volatility, refusal to accept defeat, Thus, he understood now that those words, while technically accurate, had missed the point entirely. His aide came in quietly and stood near the door. Young, Valthari, conscientious. Sorvan had trained him well. The latest engagement report, the aide said, and set a data pad on the desk. Sorvan didn't pick it up immediately. He already knew what it would say. Another loss. In another engagement where the Concord's forces had performed according to doctrine, and the Reckoning Fleet had done something doctrine had no name for, and the results had been predictably bad. "Can we stop them?" he said. The aide was quiet. He was honest. That was why Sorvan kept him. He was the kind of aide who told the truth even when the truth was unwelcome, because Sorvan had made it clear, very early in their working relationship, and that there was no point in having an aide who only told you what you wanted to hear. The aide was quiet for a long time. Too long. Sorvan picked up the data pad. The broadcast went out simultaneously to every inhabited system in the Galactic Concord. Voss had spent 3 days preparing it. She had written it herself, without help, in the middle of the night on a borrowed ship in a docking bay that smelled like fuel and old metal. She had written 6 drafts and discarded them all before she wrote the version she kept. The previous 5 had been too angry, or too cold, or too long, or they had been the right length and the right temperature, but somehow still wrong, still not the things she needed to say. The 7th version was short. She recorded it on a basic communication system and broadcast it through 23 different relay points simultaneously, so that it could not be blocked at any single point in the network, so that it reached the public channels of every species before the quorum could suppress it. Every species received it in their own language. Juno had translated it. "My name is Ambassador Yara Voss," she said in the recording. Her voice was calm. She looked into the recorder without expression, without performance. "I represent the human people, and we were declared extinct 8 years ago by the sovereign quorum of the Galactic Concord, following a secret vote that no member of the General Assembly was informed about. 38 billion of my people were killed in 11 minutes and 43 seconds on a Tuesday morning, while I was standing on Ehton Prime having a conversation about a lost cargo ship." She paused, not for effect, just because she needed a breath. "We survived, 2.3 million of us. And we have spent 8 years in the dark between your maps, and we have spent that time doing what humans do when you take everything from them. We kept going." Another pause. "To the species whose leadership voted yes on Directive Null 7. We are aware of who you are. We are coming not to destroy you, but to hold you to account. There is a difference, and we want you to understand that difference before we arrive. To the species who voted no, or abstained, or said nothing, you have one opportunity to say something now. One. I am telling you clearly and with no room for misunderstanding that this window will not remain open." She looked at the recorder. "Humanity was declared extinct," she said. "We would like to formally dispute that classification." Then the recording ended. Within 6 hours, 31 assembly members had issued public statements. By 27 of those statements formally withdrew from the sovereign quorum and called for an emergency session of the full assembly. 4 others called for a review of Directive Null 7 and demanded the quorum release its full records. The Concord had never seen anything like it. In 600 years of operation, the quorum had never had this many members publicly break from it in this short a time. In his chambers, Sorvan read the assembly statements one by one. When he finished, he set down the data pad and sat with his hands flat on the desk for a long time. Outside his viewport, Ehton Prime turned slowly. Its lights were the same as always. The lights of 400 species going about their lives. The lights of a civilization that believed it had managed the future carefully. Sorvan stared at those lights for a while. He was 40,000 years old and he had seen many things. He had seen civilizations rise and fall. And he had seen species that seemed strong turn out to be fragile, and species that seemed fragile turn out to be something else entirely. He had, he thought, made an error. Not the kind that could be apologized for, the kind that had to be answered. And the thing that was coming to answer it was already moving through the dark, already closer than his intelligence teams knew, already past the point where anything he decided in this room would change the shape of what was about to happen. When he sat there a while longer in the chair made from the wood of a tree that no longer existed. Then he called his aide in and began, quietly and without drama, to prepare for the arrival of something the galaxy had never encountered before. Something that had been declared dead and had taken that declaration as a personal challenge. Something that was, now, almost here. The Reckoning Fleet came out of dark space at 0600 hours. Galactic Standard Time. Why on a morning that nobody on Ethan Prime had been expecting? They came without warning. Not because they couldn't have given warning. They had the capability, the communication technology, the means to announce themselves with days of advance notice. They chose not to. Kaney had thought about this decision carefully over several weeks and had arrived at the same conclusion each time. She was not coming to surprise anyone. She was not coming to attack, but she was coming on her own terms, and at a time of her choosing, and the first thing she wanted the Galactic Concord to understand was that those terms existed and that they had not been negotiated. 947 ships dropped out of their transit corridors in a ring around Ethan Prime so precise and so complete that the station's defensive systems, which had been on elevated alert for 3 weeks in response to the broadcast and the assembly upheaval, registered the arrival and then simply stopped processing it correctly because there was no protocol for this. The protocol systems looked for a formation they could categorize: an attack fleet, an approaching convoy, a diplomatic escort, and found none of those things. They found a ring, a complete, unbroken ring of vessels positioned at equal intervals around the station at a distance that was inside weapons range and outside what the station's point defense systems could cover simultaneously. No shot was fired, no weapon was charged. Juno had reviewed the station's sensor capabilities in detail and had recommended the exact positioning, close enough that the station's commanders would immediately understand that any defensive action would be partial at best, far enough that it did not read as an imminent attack. The line between those two things was mathematically specific, and she had found it. Juno opened a channel to every vessel in the Concord's defensive force that was currently scrambling around Ethan Prime. 41 ships, their crews running to stations, their commanders trying to form responses to something their training had not covered. Her voice went out on every frequency simultaneously. Can Admiral Kaney request the floor? The assembly chamber on Ethan Prime was designed for 417 species. It had seats and environmental zones for all of them, arranged in concentric rings around a central speaking platform. It smelled, as it always did, like the mixed atmospheres of too many different kinds of life sharing a space. It was full. Every assembly representative present on the station had come. Many of the ones who had been in transit when the fleet appeared had rushed back. Some were attending remotely, their faces on display panels because they hadn't been able to get to the station in time. The room was the fullest it had ever been in recent memory, because every species in the Concord understood that whatever was about to happen in this room was not something you missed. Kaney walked in alone. That was a choice she had also made carefully. She could have brought officers, watched an escort, a delegation. She didn't. She walked in alone, in a gray military uniform that had no medals on it and no decorations, because she had left those things on the Reckoning out of a feeling she couldn't entirely put into words, but which had something to do with not wanting to perform authority when she already had it. She was 54 years old. She had been fighting for 8 years. She had the look of someone who had done that. Not broken, not hollowed out, but worn down to something essential, the way a piece of metal worn by long use loses its shine and gains something harder underneath. She walked to the central speaking platform and stood on it and looked around the room. She took her time. She looked at the Stori section, where Esaveth, the diplomat who had been telling Voss a joke when Earth burned, was present and not looking at her. She looked at the Valthari section, where Sorvan sat in the front row, still and composed, and watching her with the patient eyes of someone who had been watching things for 40,000 years. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. She turned to address the full chamber. She began speaking, and she did not stop for 4 hours. She had not prepared a speech. She had prepared a record. What Kaney read to the Galactic Assembly was a document that Juno and Voss and 3 historians among the survivors had spent 8 months compiling. It was the complete account of what had happened to humanity. Not an argument, not a demand, a record. She read the minutes of the quorum's secret deliberations, the full transcripts obtained through intelligence operations Voss had coordinated over 3 years, showing every session, every vote, every word spoken by every representative in the rooms where Directive Null 7 had been discussed and approved. She read the names of the species that had voted yes. She read the names of the individual representatives who had cast those votes. She read Servan's original proposal, in his own words, including the paragraph where he described the projection models that predicted humanity's threat potential in 50 years. She read the operational orders given to the 17 strike fleets. She read the battle coordinates. She read the target lists: Earth, Mars, the Jovian moons, the colonies, the military stations, the research outposts. She read Lieutenant Colonel Priya Mehta's final transmission from Callisto, word for word. Then she read names. She had said she would do this in the internal planning sessions, and Voss had asked her how long it would take, and Kaney had said 4 hours, and Voss had said the assembly will lose focus, and Kaney had said, I know and I don't care. And Voss had looked at her for a long moment and then said nothing more about it. The names of the dead were not a rhetorical device. They were not chosen for effect. They were every name the survivors had been able to recover and verify, gathered from ship manifests and colony records and family accounts and the partial databases that had been rebuilt from fragments. Not all 38 billion had been recovered. The list was incomplete, and they said so, but it was what they had, and Kaney read it. And she read it at the pace of someone who believed that every name on it deserved the time it took to say. The assembly was very quiet for those 4 hours. Not the managed quiet of formal proceedings, the real quiet of a room full of living things that had stopped fidgeting and checking their screens and thinking about other things, because what was happening in the room had pulled their full attention without asking for it. Some representatives left, not many. Most stayed. Servan stayed for all of it. He sat in his seat in the front row and he listened, and his face did not change. When Kaney finished, the chamber was silent for a long time. Then she spoke again, and her voice was different now. Still even, still controlled, but lower, quieter, like something that had been held tightly for a long time, being carefully set down. We didn't come here to destroy the concord, she said. We came here because the concord is the only structure that exists to hold this kind of moment accountable, and if we burn it down, and there is nothing to replace it with except the kind of chaos that hurts everyone, including us. We have had enough of things being burned. She looked around the room one more time. What we want, she said, is not easy, but it is specific. The terms were called the Reckoning Accords. Voss had written them. Kaney had reviewed them. Juno had run 17 iterations of the legal language to ensure there were no loopholes that a sufficiently determined species could use to circumvent the intent. The accords were not revenge. They were something harder to achieve, and in the long run, harder to undo. The sovereign quorum was to be dissolved. It had operated in secret, without accountability to the General Assembly, and it had used that secrecy to authorize an act that no governing body should ever have the power to authorize in secret. In its place, a new structure, the Galactic Council, with representatives rotating from all member species on a scheduled basis, would take its functions. No 9-species body would ever again have the authority to make species-level decisions without a full assembly vote, recorded and public. Every species whose leadership had voted yes on Directive Null 7 would appear before a war crimes tribunal. The tribunal would be composed of representatives from neutral species, presided over by 3 judges, 1 conquered legal scholar, 1 independent arbitrator from a non-conquered civilization, and Ambassador Voss. The outcomes of the tribunal were not predetermined. What was predetermined was that the tribunal would happen, that it would be public, and that the records of Directive Null 7 would be entered into full evidence. Humanity was granted sovereign territory, not charity, territory legally recognized under concord law, with clear borders and full rights of self-governance. They were granted full military recognition, meaning their fleet was acknowledged as a legitimate military force of a sovereign species, which it had always been legally, whether the concord admitted it or not. They were granted a permanent seat on the new Galactic Council with the same rights as every other member. And one additional thing, one term that had been written last and was listed last in the document, and was in some ways the most important. A monument to be constructed in the Sol system at the coordinates where Earth had once turned in the sunlight, built from materials contributed by every species that participated in Directive Null 7, as both acknowledgement and record. Visible from any ship passing through the system. Permanent. On its surface, in every language currently recognized in the Concord's linguistic database, a single inscription. Here was Earth. Remember what was lost here, and remember who caused the loss, and remember that the species who came from this place refused to be erased. Remember this, so that it never happens again. The Assembly voted. Not unanimously. There were species that had enough fear of change, or enough loyalty to the old structures, or enough shame about their own silence that they voted against various parts of the Accords. But the margins were not close. The months of chaos, the armada failures, the broadcast, the groundswell of Assembly members who had been waiting for a moment to say what they had been quietly thinking for years, all of it had moved the room to a place it would not otherwise have reached. The reckoning Accords passed. Sorvan did not speak during the proceedings. He listened. He voted. The record shows he voted against the dissolution of the Quorum and for the War Crimes Tribunal, which was a combination that surprised people who analyzed it afterward, and less surprised people who had known him a long time. He was a man who understood accountability, even when it applied to himself. Possibly especially then. He said nothing publicly after the vote. He returned to his chambers and submitted his formal resignation from Quorum leadership, and then, according to his aide's account, sat down in the old chair and did not move for several hours. Nobody disturbed him. 9 months later, a shuttle from the ISV Reckoning arrived at the coordinates in the Sol system where the monument now stood. The monument was large. Larger than Kaney had expected, though she had approved the specifications herself. It was made of stone and metal and materials she didn't have names for. It contributed from worlds she had never visited. It floated in the empty space where a planet had once been, lit by a sun that was unchanged. The sun still rose and set over nothing, still burned the way it had always burned, indifferent to what had happened in the space around it. Kaney and Roth stood at the viewport of the shuttle together. Voss was somewhere inside the new Galactic Council's first session, already deep in an argument about refugee protections for newly discovered species, because that was who she was. The monument turned slowly in the light. Kaney could read part of the inscription from here, depending on which face was turned toward the shuttle. She read pieces of sentences, words in languages she recognized, and words in languages she didn't. Roth asked quietly, "Was it enough?" He always asked the hard questions. It was one of the things she both appreciated and occasionally found exhausting about him. She was quiet for a while. She thought about what enough would mean. She thought about 38 billion names, and she thought about the names she had read in the assembly chamber. And she thought about Priya Mehta on Callisto saying we are holding and meaning it right up until she couldn't say anything anymore. She thought about 2.3 million people in the dark, building something from nothing, turning grief into motion. She thought about everything that had been taken and everything that could not be given back and everything that had been built in the space where the lost lived. "No," she said finally. Her voice was level. She had known the answer before he asked. "It's never enough. You can't balance what was lost. That's not how loss works." Roth nodded. He had known that too. "But it's a start," she said. She kept looking at the monument, at the sun behind it, the same sun that had risen over a planet that was gone, at the cold and open space where 8 billion people had once gone about their lives on a Tuesday morning. She thought about Sorvan's words, read from the official record of his original proposal, the words about humanity, about their volatility, their unpredictability, their refusal to accept defeat, the words that had been written as a reason to eliminate them. She thought about how right he had been about every characteristic he described, and how catastrophically wrong he had been about what those characteristics meant. Human beings were volatile. They were emotional. They were unpredictable. They formed attachments, and they grieved those attachments, and they carried those attachments forward into everything they did. They didn't process loss cleanly and efficiently and move on according to schedule. They dragged their losses with them like fuel, heavy, necessary, burning slow and long and hot. They didn't give up because giving up, for a human being, required a kind of acceptance that the human brain was not built for. Not the acceptance of a single loss, which humans were entirely capable of. The acceptance of the loss of everything. The acceptance that there was no next step, that the story was over. That kind of acceptance. The Concord had been counting on it, had modeled it. When it had assumed that a species, faced with total destruction, would process the reality of their situation and reach a rational conclusion about the impossibility of resistance. The Concord had not understood that for 2.3 million human beings, floating in the dark after the worst thing that had ever happened to their species, the rational conclusion had simply not been one of the options their brains were offering them. The option their brains offered was, keep going. So they had. Kaney turned away from the viewport and went back to the inside of the shuttle, where her aide was waiting with a schedule for the afternoon. There were meetings. There were always meetings now. The new Galactic Council was forming its structures, and humanity's representatives were involved in everything, arguing for everything, the way humans did. She sat down and looked at the schedule and began to prepare. Outside, through the viewport, the monument kept turning in the light. The inscription faced the shuttle for a moment, fully visible, every word of it. Here was Earth. Remember what was lost here, and remember who caused the loss, and remember that the species who came from this place refused to be erased. Remember this, so that it never happens again. The shuttle turned away, and the monument was behind them, and ahead was the rest of what came next. 2.3 million people had become a civilization again. Not the same civilization. Not the one that had been growing on Earth and Mars and 3 other star systems before a Tuesday morning changed everything. That civilization was gone. They were not getting it back, and they had stopped pretending they were. They were something new, built from the same material, carrying the same memory. Moving forward, not because moving forward made the grief smaller, but because humanity had never been particularly good at standing still. And they had been feared because of what they might become. Then they had been erased because of that fear. Then they had proven, in the most complete way imaginable, that the fear had been right about the wrong things. They weren't dangerous because they were building weapons, or because they were advancing too fast, or because their military technology was accelerating in ways that made careful old civilizations nervous. And they were dangerous because of something much simpler and much harder to model. They refused to accept the shape of things as fixed. They refused to look at a situation, any situation, no matter how catastrophic, no matter how final it appeared from the outside, and decide that this was just how it was. They always believed there was another move. There had been a move. There was always a move. And as long as there was a move, there was a reason to keep going. The shuttle moved away from the monument into the light of the same sun that had always risen over Seoul, and behind it the inscription turned in empty space, visible to anyone who came close enough to read it. Anyone passing through the system on any heading would see it. They would read it, and they would remember. That was the point. That had always been the point.